Thanks for joining us on the Method Made podcast, where we have been discussing operational challenges in technology transfer. And this is something me and you have discussed previously, that there are a lot of sort of communication challenges in tech transfer. You have a lot of experience in drug development and the business development sides. I'm hoping in this conversation today we can discuss some of these challenges and what new companies might want to think about moving forward as they're engaging in their preparation to engage in CDMOs in the future.
I think that's great.
Great. So I would love to start off maybe talking about some of on the business side, where communication breakdowns can happen during technology transfer, maybe starting at the beginning of the process. We've discussed on this podcast a lot of the technical places, but I'd love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what we spoke about initially, right? There's a lot of issue in the tech transfer from a scientific perspective as far as what you need to transfer in data set and common process and making sure that there's how you process things over. But from a commercial perspective, when you're talking about the front end, I think there's a lot. That's really where it starts, to be quite honest with you, because your first tech transfer that you do is after you sign a client and tech transfer their business into the company. And a lot of times people do that in a very reactive way instead of proactively engaging and putting something in place to make that be more of a seamless process. For instance, when you sign, how do you get them into your systems to actually invoice them? How do you transfer over their data? How do you introduce them to the clients internally, or to the scientists internally, to the project manager, who then overtakes and manages the relationship from that point? A lot of those things get overlooked, I believe. And I think from a tech transfer perspective, that's where it begins. And then after that, it's the process of how that happens then internally.
Okay. So there's a few people involved. There's the business development, the technical teams. So I guess the business team, that's the front end you mentioned, like the initial point of contact. And is that usually between business development people on both sides? I'm curious about what the progression looks like between the technical teams on both sides, like within the contracting company and the CDMO and the business development people. Is there like a general timeline? Is it business development people first and then over to the technicals?
Yeah, and quite frankly, I think it depends on the modality and what you're dealing with and how technical the cell is. Right now, sitting in cell and gene therapy, I think that technical connection happens from the very first connection that you have with the client. So BD is leading those conversations. They're prospecting, they're finding the client, the right fit for the client. But then it's bringing in that subject matter expert from the very beginning to have that dialogue and conversation to make sure that there's a fit. I would say one of the biggest disconnects, and it's a common issue, is that there is a lack of connection between business development and operations. So often, and I've written about this, that the BD has to sell what operations does, and operations has to do what BD sells. And if there's a disconnect there, then you're just going to have the wrong client. So having those early conversations with your scientific experts ahead of time to make sure that the fit is there is, to me, the most important thing. Because the last thing you want to do is you have won a contract with a client on a project that doesn't quite fit, and it will just derail everything internally. So when you go to do that tech transfer of client into your operations, there's going to be a lot of disconnect and finger pointing and saying, how am I going to support this client?
That makes a lot of sense. So what might fitting or not fitting look like? Is it that business development might not have a very descriptive understanding of the technical capacities the technical team might have? Or what can lead to that kind of fitting or not fitting?
That's exactly it. It's just the lack of conversation and lack of understanding. So within cell and gene therapy, just in general, there's a big story there, right? About how kind of chaotic stuff has gotten with the number of CDMOs that have arisen over the last 5 years and how that's impacted the technology know-how that's out there. It's really diluted the expertise. So there's a lot of those pieces involved. Companies will call themselves even cell and gene therapy CDMO, but when you really look internally, are they set up for cell therapy or are they set up for gene therapy? And if your BD is not really clear about that, they're selling anything, right? They're just bringing in projects because projects are needed. But when you bring those projects in and they don't fit with either your resources from an equipment perspective or resources from a personnel standpoint, then you're just going to fail. So that clarity has to start from the very beginning. And often you're just reading the 8x10 glossy about here's who we are as an organization, or even the website, here's who we are as an organization. And a lot of it is, this is what we want to be, not what we are today. And you need to sell what you are today. And that disconnect can happen from the very beginning, from a BD standpoint.
That makes a lot of sense. And I'm also curious about the CDMOs. I wonder if there are, my understanding is a lot of CDMOs will evolve over time. They're not always purpose built for exactly what they're doing at that time. So I'm curious, is that the case in cell and gene, where are most of the CDMOs built with cell and gene in mind, and they have all of that equipment that's purpose built for that, or is it evolving through the market landscapes of what's in demand at the time?
So I think there's three ways that the CDMO industry has grown to where it is today. The first one was really initially through acquisition, right? There were big companies that wanted to have that modality underneath their umbrella because they really saw the high value of what it was worth, not recognizing where it is in its maturity and wanting to bring that modality in. So basically, initially through the acquisition aspect. And the really key part there is, how do you bring that company into the overall part of the organization? And how do you let them continue to work as they should to be progressive and support their client without derailing them if you're bringing in systems and processes that maybe not doesn't fit with how they need to work, because that modality is very different than when you look at oral solids or biologics. The other way has been from the ground up, right? So companies who wanted to get involved in cell and gene therapy, again, the cell and gene therapy often is just a disconnect. It's just cell and gene therapy. They're used together all the time, but they're two separate entities. They're two separate businesses, modalities. But it was built from ground up, purpose built, and often purpose built incorrectly, because a lot of companies built in commercial when really we're still in the development aspect of cell and gene therapy. And company can call them cell and gene, but when you come in, really they're more equipped mechanically, equipment wise, as gene therapy, but they're still presenting themselves as cell and gene. But then the third way is where a company maybe is developing an asset and has private equity or money that's coming in to help develop that, and maybe they run out of money or the money is backed out and they need a source of revenue. So they change their company into a CDMO. And then that typically will drive the appropriate modality. We are a cell therapy, we are a gene therapy, but that's when you get into the messiness of, you don't know what you don't know, and are you really building your organization as a CDMO should be, versus I'm just developing my own therapy as my own organization.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And we previously discussed you don't know what you don't know. I would love to hear a bit more about how this plays into that aspect of the tech transfer.
So it plays into it in that reactive versus proactive, right? Like when you're onboarding a client, what do you need to do to onboard that client? There's a lot of paperwork involved, right? And I made a comment earlier, like, how do you get them into your system so that you can actually invoice them, so they're in your accounting side of the business? Do you have a SharePoint data? How are you going to actually share information in between each other? Where are the connections and the what am I trying to think, the conflict scale, right? If something happens, who do you actually go to? Those things should be pre-planned. They should pre-understood as to what you need to follow if a problem happens, or what you need to follow just bringing the client in, and how those communications are. How often are you connecting and talking with the client on a weekly basis, bi-weekly basis, whatever that case may be. And then even from an internal standpoint, how is process development and analytical communicating with each other for that one project? Is there a cadence of dialogue? Is there a cadence of meetings that they have? Is there data share internally that you have that visibility to? Those things often aren't proactively thought through, and so you don't have those systems in place. So you're forcing a process to happen based on need versus based on understanding. And that's where it can become very difficult, where information can get lost, disconnects can happen, wrong information gets transferred, timelines then get pushed out, you start not being able to meet your client expectation, et cetera. Again, that tech transfer piece has to do, from my perspective, developing it, risk testing it, trying it out before you actually have to utilize it, so that you're prepared for whatever comes to you when you're doing that transfer.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so my understanding is during these transfers, there's three places that this will happen. So you've got the biotech company, then it goes to a process development lab, and then from there it'll get shipped into the GMP lab. And I've heard that generally communication happens smoothly between process development and manufacturing, but I'm curious if do you see a sort of range of that in the CDMOs? Is that something customers might have better or worse experiences with in different contexts?
I think so. And I think this is one of the areas where if you're sitting again in the cell and gene, to always ask questions, always be curious, never make assumptions, that process actually can happen. Because often, again, if you're building from the ground up, you don't have that historical experience. You don't have that data set that you can share and say, this is how many times we've done this. This is the data set that we did and shows that we can actually transfer from process development to our GMP facility. So asking those questions ahead of time and understanding what are those connections, I think is really important. But I do think that it depends on the organization, but it is, again, that proactive connection between. And when you talk about process development and going into GMP, again, there's a lot of assumption that there's, from an equipment perspective, that there's for understanding and experience. And if that is not there, again, based on assumption, then when that transfer happens, you're not going to be able to execute it in the same way that actually was developed in your process development space. So again, having that connection and communication is so important, MSAT division, to really carry that work over. One story I'll tell quickly that I just really surprised me. I was asking about attrition in the analytical process development space, and the number that was mentioned to me, it was a company that had gotten acquired, and he said 30% of attrition in analytical, and I thought that was really high. And he said, no, they've gone to quality control. And then I thought, oh, that's fantastic, because then they're going to know what needs to happen, and they're going to have that connection because they've come from the analytical team. But was surprised to say, no, there's still a lot of finger pointing, and there's still a lot of, you should have been doing this and you didn't develop this right, and why didn't you have that? And to me, that's just a connection and a communication issue, right? You need to establish those connections and meetings ahead of time so that QC management or GMP, when they're receiving those programs coming over ready for GMP manufacturing, that there's already a knowledge and understanding of who the client is, what the project is, and what the needs are, and there's that communication already happening. So it varies. I think companies do that very well, and there are some companies that don't have anything in place. And again, it's just a trial and error issue.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And you mentioned historical data. So something that through a few conversations has come up is that this historical data really is that structure that allows people to know what they're supposed to do. And so I guess this is something different that you see maybe more in emerging sort of areas, like cell and gene is not cutting edge, but it's a very new technology. So maybe it's seen more in this area due to the novelty in that.
I would say so. Yeah. It's going new into it, and therefore what is it that you need? And again, it goes to a little bit of I don't know what I don't know to some degree. But yeah, because so much of what happened, where cell and gene sits right now, is in the development space. And then how does that progress on? And if you're moving it up from the ground up, and it's not a modality that you've had and you don't have that data set available, you're not able to prove to your clients that you have the ability and capability. And that's where I say internally that we should be working on our own programs then, our own projects. Let's create data based on building a platform that we can then use for our own clients, and you start building your data sets that you can share.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So also within cell and gene, I'd like to think specifically about cell and gene here. With the CDMOs, I see it as being a little bit unique compared to other modalities, like vaccine manufacturing, for example. You can have one facility and make a huge amount of vaccine. And if you have a quality misstep, for example, due to a communication error, you're going to lose thousands of dollars and a few days, weeks, but you'll be able to get back on track because you can just go back and you're going to have access to those source materials and those materials that you need. But I think it's a bit different in cell and gene, where when you're working with personalized medicines and you're taking one person's cells, manipulating them, and then giving them back to that person, you don't have that sort of that leeway that you have when you have abundant resources.
Yes. Correct. And I think we spoke about this when we first talked. That was the whole purpose for me coming into this industry, quite frankly, because of this connectivity that's needed, this cross-departmental communication, the collaboration that's needed in this very intimate supply chain of sourcing from a person and having it come in, developing the therapy and bringing it back to that person, that the need of that connection and communication, and quite frankly, just tech transfer process, right, has to be fine-tuned, right? But you don't see that a lot of times. And that's just really surprising, right? And so there's the focus on the therapy development itself, but not the front end and the back end of how do you get it from and how do you get it back to, right? And so that supply chain process. And then there's also the understanding of location, right? So the proximity is so important. And there's a lot of conversation out there about we can't reach our patients, our end users. And that gets into understanding where your patients sit and how educating them and educating the supply chain process and how you get your products to the client. But a lot of that's not part of the development process in thinking through that whole supply chain case management of how you get things to your patient. But that is a thing, a disconnect, I think, that's out there in quite a lot of the companies from a cell and gene CDMO's perspective, because it's about the manufacturing, the therapy, not about the both ends of the process that you need to have. That's the most important.
Yeah, yeah. And so I'm curious how, broadly speaking, there's a lot of places that there's, as we're discussing, there's a lot of potential disconnects in terms of communication there. And so this seems like a particularly high risk place for those disconnects when you've got patient cells in transit and making sure that communication happens. Yeah, I wonder, what do you see as some top opportunities for improving that communication during those tech transfers from on the business development side? So yeah, say is there an opportunity, say, between the business development people on either side?
Yeah, and I think it's just engaging in the conversation, because a lot of the question is, where does that management sit? Does it sit with the sponsor themselves? Okay, where's the source material coming from, and are they managing that, getting it to the CDMO, and then are they managing on the other end? There are companies out there that do case management and actually manage that whole entire process, which I feel is important to engage in from a sponsor perspective. But from a CDMO standpoint, I've always thought, when I very first came into working with a CDMO, that it's a differentiator if you could have your own, right, internally, and be able to manage that process and offer that to your client. If that's too complex or too much, then at least partner with a company out there that has that case management ability, so that you can offer that as somebody, this is a company that we've worked with and they know how we work, we know how they work, and we can help you with that seamless process of getting it from the patient to the patient on either end. So really, I think it's just about engaging in that conversation early on and asking the question from a BD standpoint: how are you managing the supply chain process? We can manage the cell therapy, but where is the product coming from? How is it getting to? And is that something that you've engaged in, have a company that you're working with at the moment? And if not, we can actually help partner you with that, because we have somebody on our side. I see that as a huge differentiator that I don't think a lot of CDMOs are really taking advantage of.
Okay, so that seems, yeah, very important during the tech transfer process. And so it sounds like this sort of a new thing? Like, it's not industry standard yet, but people are starting to offer it. Where does that sort of sit in the industry right now?
I think it's a new thing that's just barely being tapped, quite frankly, because a lot of times in the people I've spoken to and the companies I've spoken to, that's not part of the process. The ownership sits on the sponsor. And that's fair, right? Because again, where the source of material is coming, that's on their side, right? From a therapy development perspective. But I think it's a responsibility of the CDMO to really understand how that's being managed and how they can engage and help that process, because they are very much a part of that tech transfer overall, right? They're the main part of the management you have your own tech transfer internally that we're talking about, but there's the grander process of tech transfer when you're talking about patient to sponsor to CDMO to sponsor to patient. That there's a big one there. And so I think it's an untapped part, at least from the companies in parts of the industry that I've engaged in, and continue to feel that could be a differentiator. Because I was reading something just recently, I think it came out from SCORE, of how do you differentiate yourself? Everybody's saying we're flexible, we want to partner, we can manage everything that you need to, we're end to end, et cetera, et cetera. But everybody says that. And so what are your differentiators? So where are areas that you can look at to bring in that others aren't offering? I truly believe that this is one of them.
Okay. Yeah, and it seems like communication really, I've also seen some recent webinars, and it seems to be a sort of big deal. I've heard that a lot of companies will prefer to work with people locally. And I'm curious from your perspective, if working with CDMOs that are closer by, if you see maybe less of those communication, if distance might create some of those communication problems.
That's an interesting question. I don't know. Obviously, we always say COVID changed that, right? Because we now can speak this way. I would say, from myself being a BD leader through my career, I was doing video conferencing far before that, because you're managing people outside of your area. I think from a CDMO perspective, it has become easier to be able to engage. They have people in plant where it's a video that you can see what's happening and all of that. They're replacing things like that to make it easier. When it comes to cell therapy in particular, I think proximity counts. Certainly proximity and where it is to local airports and the engagement in transportation companies and things of that sort. Proximity counts there. And certainly with gene therapy too, of just understanding where's the endpoint and how do you get your product there. I think it's gotten to a point where communication and how people want to communicate, whether it be in there in person or video, it's a personal preference. I don't feel proximity counts as it being whether they're going to be successful or not, quite frankly. But yeah, I see it more as a personal thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so one thing that's also I've heard in some recent media about cell and gene therapy CDMOs is discussions about language barriers. I'm curious if, in your experience, a lot of these transfers, do they happen within like all in English? Is there a lot of international movement happening?
I haven't touched on that in a while, to be honest with you. But when I was with Patheon back in the day, we always made sure everything was in English, anything that was happening over in Italy or France. And you always had very good English speaking individuals who could communicate from a PM perspective. And that wasn't really a barrier. It's an interesting question in this space, and I don't have a good answer for it, but I think that language barrier can occur, and if it does, can be more of an issue again, because in cell therapy, you're moving so much more quickly, right? That process has to happen so much quicker that if you add in more variables and issues that might be like the language barrier, that could be a bigger problem. But I haven't seen or had any personal experience with it.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, I imagine also with particularly technical things like cell and gene therapy that even if it's not your first language, it could be difficult to have all of that sort of set up like that. So yeah, maybe one last thing that would be interesting to discuss would be about siloed departments. This is something that's come up before. So it seems generally like the best communication happens when people are working together, for instance, between process development and GMP labs as frequently and often as possible. So I wonder if you see an opportunity for, say, new companies that might be looking down the road towards process development, engaging with CDMOs, to start that communication early. Yeah, what do you think about that?
Starting the communication early from a sponsor into the CDMO perspective.
Yeah. Like the silo between the sponsor and the CDMO, just bridge that gap early as possible to reduce some of those communication errors down the line.
Absolutely. Honestly, it's all about communication, and the silos are there internally. And that's the biggest thing to try to break down and figure out. And that's a lot of what I'm doing, right, as Chrysalis, is coming in and trying to really open up those cross-departmental collaborations, which are so important for the success and so important to understand the why and what people are doing too. Because again, the why I think is so important, that helps that tech transfer. I am the part of this piece that helps this part, that helps the therapy in this way. But from a client coming in, sponsor coming into a CDMO, I think early engagement in the appropriate people. Again, BD is always the front runner, right? They're always in the front representing the organization. They have to represent the organization in the best possible way, in the realest way as to what they actually do well and what they can execute and deliver on today. But then engaging those scientific matter experts, the SMEs head on so that they're starting to have that collaboration and conversation with their SMEs so that there's a good dialogue and good relationship building. Bringing a PM, I think, early is important too, because the relationship from the client transfers from the BD to the project manager. Again, why that initial tech transfer is so important, because that's really what you're doing. You're doing an initial internal tech transfer, BD to PM. Here's what this person's all about. Here's what they like, they don't, here's the personality. You can get them to know who they are before they even come in the door. And then there's the tech transfer of the sponsor coming into the greater group. And then you might have some of those relationships already built if that early discussion is happening versus just BD dealing with the contract and getting a signature and saying, here you go. And then there's this, everybody starting from the ground up and trying to build an understanding of each other. And relationships drive everything, right? You want to have a good connection. And that happens. Sometimes you might have an analytical person that with the sponsor that doesn't engage. So you just have to pivot a little bit. And when you have an understanding early on, you can make those changes even proactively.
Yeah, yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. A lot of people seem to be focused on the like documents. It is a lot of documents involved in these transfers, but someone
There
actually
is.
has to hand them over and talk to someone else. So
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
I
And
guess that's really the opportunity.
understand what the documents are and where you're going to put them and how who's going to be managing them and how you're handling it. But yeah, to me, that the communication, the people, the process and tech transfer around, that's such a big part of it. And it does start from the initial engagement of BD to client. And it's the transfer of understanding and knowledge of the client, making sure that it's aligned with what we do from an internal, and then it goes from there with everything we've been talking about.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks for joining us today on today's episode of the Method Made podcast. Yeah, thanks so much.
My pleasure. Yeah, I have pleasure speaking with you. Thanks for the time.
Great.